welcoming in Dr. Raj, doctor of physical therapy, fitness and movement coach, mindfulness, sports scientist. You can follow him on Twitter at 3CB Performance. Dr. Raj, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Hey, not too bad. I wish I was joining on, better pretenses.
Yeah.
So, how y'all doing?
We're doing well, thank you. Of course, as we know, Chris Paul has suffered a right thumb avulsion fracture. So,
Mhm.
can you kind of just break this down for us? Explain exactly what that injury is.
Sure, so break is the apt term, I think. And so, essentially, with an avulsion, what happens is it's that either a muscle or a tendon essentially chips off a piece of the bone, and in this case, it happened at most likely, if you looked at where he was grabbing at when the injury happened and how it happened, he was grabbing at, like, the base, the inner base of that thumb called the ulnar side, and so, I think he jammed it. I can't remember on what specific player, one of the Rockets players, and so that can lead to a muscle pulling off chipping off a piece of that bone, and so that's why you saw him in a cast. They're allowing for that bone to heal. And then, as you guys heard about, I'm sure yesterday, that return timeline, you have to allow for bone healing. And so he'll be reevaluated in that 6 to 8 week time frame.
So with that time frame, a lot of people have been wondering about this because back in 2017, he missed, I think his original timeline was 6 to 8 weeks, but he missed like 5.5 with a UCL thumb injury, which is
Mhm.
obviously different. But I was just curious to clear up some of that confusion. Is this a similar type of situation where he might be able to return before that projected timeline, or is it just hard to say?
So with the UCL thumb injuries, that's a ligament injury. There's actually a new technique that they use to help actually expedite that process, which is why you likely saw him come back quicker. Like for example, Lakers Taylor Horton Tucker came back in about 5 weeks with the
Mhm.
same procedure. I think it's Dr. Shin in LA that they both use, and so that's kind of that time frame has now kind of been outdated. Whereas when it comes to fractures, you have to allow for that bone healing,
Mhm.
and is there always a chance that he might come back quicker? Of course, right? But we haven't really seen as much in the data. And also, when it comes to these injuries, we don't really know the full specifics. Whereas with a UCL thumb injury, it's a lot more specific because you know the specific ligament. All we know in this case is that, hey, he has a fracture in that thumb. And it can even come down to kind of the extent of that fracture as well. How much was chipped off, right? We
Sure.
don't know.
So, best case scenario, 6 to 8 weeks. Worst case scenario, what does that kind of look like since we don't know, just kind of going from one end of the spectrum to the other?
Yeah, I would say best case, he's reevaluated at 6, and then typically with most apps, about a week return to play, get him back up to speed, and so you're looking at 7 weeks, which coincides with the start of the playoffs, right? Worst case scenario is that there's some complication in his rehab. There's something sometimes called a Stenner lesion, which can interfere with healing, which can push that out to 8 to 10 weeks. Although it's not all that common, and they would know that early on. I think the fact that he didn't have surgery, excuse me, and he actually played in part of the All-Star game
Mhm.
probably is a good indicator that, hey, it's not surgery isn't required and it's not, all that significant, or they wouldn't have let him play in that game. The biggest thing to me with Chris being an older player and you have the playoffs obviously coming up is that getting him up to speed quickly and back in rhythm, and the fact that it's on his dominant shooting hand is also a key consideration here, right? And so those to me are more of considerations in the actual healing process.
Sure, that makes sense, and that was kinda gonna be my follow-up is, you mentioned in your video that you posted on Twitter, about range of motion and that rehab and recovery process. Do you think that this is a situation where he probably won't start shooting and dribbling until after he's been reevaluated, just or is that something that he can gradually work in over the next few weeks?
It's hard to say, but I think it just depends on how he recovers.
Mhm.
And so with these injuries, especially at the elite pro level where you're checking in daily with the players, There's no like, oh, just come back in 3 weeks and we'll see how you are, right? Like anyone else would be. It's hey man, how you doing today? If we need imaging, we'll get the imaging. And so you can start that process whenever that healing is completed or completed to the extent that it's required. And then you're seeing indicators based on that range of motion, that strength, what that pain and discomfort level is like. And so if you start to see him back on the court prior to that 6 weeks, it's a pretty indicator that he's going to be cleared at that reevaluation point. And so those are always things to pay attention to. I think a key thing with this also is the fact that it is part of his upper body. So he can still maintain his conditioning level. Whereas, let's say if it was lower body, you're going to be typically, de-weighted or not allowed to do some of that conditioning work. And that's really important for him, considering the intensity of the playoffs and how much, emphasis there is on him in the playoffs, especially with this, him being on the ball as much as he is.
So, what exactly does the rehab recovery process look like here? Is it just as simple as getting rest and keeping that wrist steady or that thumb steady?
No, I mean, typically, so more and more protocols now, you want to, when it's possible, get back to range of motion, strength work as quickly as you can, as quickly, of course, balancing that with the healing of the bone. And that's always the question is at what point is the bone healed enough where you can start now implementing some of that range of motion, the flexibility, and the strength work back into, especially, as I said, with his right hand where the grip strength is really important for him. And so the quicker you can get back to that, the quicker typically you see returns. And the main thing with finger injuries in general is that range of motion and not letting those things stiffen up, because they will stiffen up really, really quickly. And so that's going to be the key considerations with him.
Sure. And I think we all know Chris Paul pretty well. He's a guy that will probably, even if he's not fully healed, might try to play through something if it comes to playoff time. Is there a risk of re-injury with this type of thing?
Typically not. Typically not. Once the fracture's healed and he clears all the indicators, he should be good to go. It's more so of a concern if it is a ligament injury and things of that nature. But I mean, long term with these injuries, and I mentioned this in the video, the prognosis, is quite good. And so, of course, he's going to miss the time. But the Suns have a 6.5 game lead, so they've earned that cushion for him. And so I think all things considered, the fact that it is just an avulsion fracture and there isn't ligament damage, those are good signs.
Is there anything else that we should be aware of with an injury like this, or any final thoughts for us?
No, I think the main thing I'd like to talk about is just, I know they gave that 6 to 8 week timeline, but once he's healed, it's really just paying attention for people who want to, really understand when he might come back. It's just focusing on, hey, is he maybe on the court more often? Is he getting some of that ball work in, right? And so that's really the true indicators that about whether he's going to return at 6 weeks or if it will be longer.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Raj, for your time and your information. We really appreciate you joining us today. And one more time for everyone listening, you can follow Dr. Raj on Twitter at 3CB Performance. He puts out a lot of great informational videos around sports and sports physical therapy. We'll see you next time.